Hello there, AP Environmental Science class. Welcome to part one of my lecture on Chapter 10, Sustaining Terrestrial Biodiversity, Forests, Public Lands, Grasslands, Wetlands, and Cities. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at things, there are 91 slides to this chapter. So this is a rather large chapter. As a result, I'm going to be splitting up the videos into three parts. Normally, so far, I've been splitting them up into two parts. But I'm going to be doing this chapter in three parts, so approximately 30 slides for each part. And once again, part one begins now. So let's get right into it. We're going to our core case study on Costa Rica, a global conservation leader. Costa Rica was once covered in tropical forest. They suffered widespread deforestation between 1963 and 1983. However, Costa Rica still harbors great biodiversity. They have a lot of microclimates. If you know Costa Rica, I've never been there. My parents have been there twice. They loved it so much. There are microclimates all around the country. The Gulf Coast on one side of mountains, the Pacific Ocean on the other side of mountains. In the mountains, you got microclimates. So that provides a variety of habitats. More than 25% of Costa Rica has turned its land into nature reserves and natural parks, and the government actually pays landowners to restore forests. Why? Because they realized in the 1980s that they could make a lot of money on ecotourism. So they realized that by cutting down the forest to plant, they were not making as much money as if they kept the forest and then brought tourists in to spend money in those forests. And that's what Costa Rica has found out. That's what Costa Rica has done. And that's why Costa Rica is prospering now as a tourist destination. So what are we looking at now? One of those beautiful spots. This is La Fortuna Falls, located in the Arenal National Park in Costa Rica. Again, just a beautiful place to visit if you ever get a chance. Definitely, I'll get there one day. Definitely on my bucket list. All right, so how should we manage and sustain forest and public lands? Again, how can we basically take the lead that Costa Rica has been providing around on the planet and kind of emulate what they have done? Well, forest ecosystems provide ecosystem services far greater in value, right? This is just what I'm talking about. Far greater in value than the value of the wood or other raw materials that the forest may be able to produce themselves. Forests can be preserved by halting government subsidies that hasten their destruction, by protecting our old growth forest, and by sustainably harvesting trees. And we'll talk about a bunch of this as we go through the next couple of slides. So, putting a price on nature's ecosystem services. We're going to really start talking in the next couple of slides about that full cost pricing that we've mentioned a bunch of times so far in this course. Ecological economists estimate the value of Earth's ecosystem services. So these are the ecosystem services that the Earth provides, and these are the estimates that our ecological economists say is what it actually provides for us. So waste treatment, right? What the Earth does to filter out waste in water and in the air, things like that, amounts to about $22.5 trillion a year in services. Recreation, right? Just talked about tourism, just talked about boating on aquatic systems, things like that. $20.6 trillion per year. Erosion control, right? Food production, nutrient cycling. These are all ecosystem services that the planet provides. And you'll notice estimates well over $10 trillion a year for all of these services. So again, when you put a price on these services, then you have to begin to put the price or factor in that price into the products that you're using to here on the planet that actually end up degrading those services. So since 1997, the world has been losing ecosystem services valued at a little over $20 trillion per year. Ongoing source of ecological income could be these services if we use them sustainably. And that's, again, what this course is all about. What do we need to do? I've mentioned it before. I'll mention it again. I'll mention it right now. We need to use the full cost pricing that includes the value of the ecosystem services in the prices of forest goods and services out there. We need to start factoring in the full cost pricing. And that means wood is going to or should cost much more than it already does. You already hear people complaining about how much wood costs. It should be costing more because we should be factoring in the ecosystems, ecological services that forests provide for us when we cut them down and we produce timber with them, or we cut them down for monoculture. That's something we're going to learn about over the next couple of chapters is bad as well. So what we had here, this is basically an oil palm tree plantation. We used to have here a tropical forest, which had a bunch of different trees, right? A lot of biodiversity. It was cut down, and only palm oil trees were planted, right? Why? Because you want to make money. You want to use these palm trees to produce oil, right? That then you can sell. But unfortunately, what has happened is produced a monoculture, or just one type of tree, which reduces your biodiversity. And again, that's what we're seeing happening around the world with our forest. Here are some more of those economic and ecosystem services that these forests provide for us. So what do? They help remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, right? We did our carbon sequestration lab a couple of months ago. Helps stabilize atmospheric temperatures. Forests store water and release that water slowly. Forests provide habitat for 2/3 of the world's terrestrial species. Forests provide biofuel, industrial wood, and traditional medicines for us as well. So these are just some of the ecosystem services that forests provide. Here are some more. So again, what have we talked about? A great chart here so that you can use some of these if you need them on an FRQ. So forests, natural capital. What are some ecosystem services forests provide? They support energy flow, chemical cycling. They reduce soil erosion. They absorb and release water, purify water and air, influence local and regional climate, right? Like we just talked about, by storing atmospheric carbon, provide habitats for lots of wildlife, economic services, fuel wood, lumber, pulp to make paper, mining, livestock raising, recreation, and jobs. Again, all the natural capital that forests provide us. Once again, I would definitely have a general understanding of at least a few of these on either side of the chart so that you can use them on a potential FRQ. Now, forests vary in age and structure. So we have a couple of different types of terms out there. We have a forest called a primary or an old growth forest. These are forests that have been uncut or undisturbed for at least 200 years or more. They are reservoirs of biodiversity. We then have something called second growth forests. These are trees that have formed from secondary ecological succession. And we have a tree plantation or a tree farm, a commercial forest. These are forests that have the same age trees that are clear cut and then replanted to supply industrial wood. So what are we looking at here? This is an old growth forest in Poland. Believe it or not, we have no old growth forests left here in the United States, and I'm going to show you a chart on that in just a bit. So we need to talk about ways to harvest trees. The first step that when you have to harvest trees, the first step is to build logging roads. And what I'll show you on the next chart, or next picture, on the next slide, when you start building logging roads, that starts the fragmentation and the degradation of your forest. There is selective cutting. This is when intermediate age or mature trees are cut singly or in small groups. That's called selective cutting. You then have something called clear cutting, which is just what it sounds like. You're just clearing out or removing all the trees in an area. And then you have something called strip cutting, which is like clear cutting, but in strips. So instead of taking out an entire forest, you're going to clear strips of forest with trees. So again, selective cutting, clear cutting, strip cutting. Those are your three ways that we harvest trees. And again, we'll talk about them in a bit. So here we go. Again, this is building roads, right? This is the first step in harvesting trees. And what you'll notice is here's an old growth forest. We cut it down to build that logging road to get the trucks in to be able to cut down the trees and then take the timber out, right? But that is the initial stage of causing fragmentation of habitats, which we spoke about in the previous chapter, right? So then the road now fragments this forest, which then we start clear cutting more of it, produces even more fragmentation, and obviously now you have a forest where how can the creatures who live here get over to this side of the forest, right? They can't do it anymore, and so now you have problems with breeding, now you have problems with offsprings, and now you have the potential for creatures and organisms to become extinct. All right, this shows us the three major ways to harvest trees. So the first is called selective cutting. Obviously, from an ecological standpoint, selective cutting is the best way to go. You go out there, you select individual trees that are old enough, you cut them down, but you leave most of the forest intact so that you don't have creatures. Again, they can still move around here. They can still move and find mates and find food and find their niches, right? Because you're not cutting down the entire forest. You're just selecting individual trees. Clear cutting, just what it sounds like, guys. You just clear cut the entire forest. Obviously, this is a ecological disaster here. And then you have strip cutting, kind of, I guess, in between the clear cutting and the selective cutting, right? Instead of cutting down the entire forest, you just take strips of it and cut down strips of it. But I would argue that still fragments your forest, right? So that still doesn't help with the biodiversity, doesn't help with the organisms living in that forest. So again, maybe this is a little better than clear cutting, the strip cutting, but again, you're still fragmenting your forest. Only type of cutting that doesn't fragment the forest is the selective cutting. Fires also affect forest ecosystems. Fires aren't always terrible, but unfortunately, with climate change, we are seeing the lengthening and the severity of our fires increase. There are two types of fires to know about. One is called a surface fire. The surface fire is just what it sounds like. It's on the surface. It usually burns leaf litter and undergrowth, and it can provide several ecological benefits by surface fires. So actually, there are some cultures out there, some Native American cultures that actually do surface fires every couple of months, because not only does it help prevent a crown fire to start, which we'll talk about next, but again, gives you some ecological benefits, right? By clearing out all the leaf litter and the underbrush, you actually allow other plants and trees to now begin to grow where maybe they didn't have the sunlight to be able to do that, right? By burning the underleaf and the leaf litter, you're creating nutrients, right, that get cycled into the soil, which then can help produce more in the way of other plants and things like that. So actually, some surface fires can be beneficial. Crown fires, though, are not necessarily. They're extremely hot. They burn your whole tree. They kill wildlife, and they increase topsoil erosion. A crown fire is almost like clear cutting a forest, right? The fire is just wiping everything out, and then you're going to get a lot of erosion, a lot of wildlife that is either killed or can't live there anymore. And again, climate change is lengthening and strengthening that fire season. So what are we looking at here? On the left is your surface fire, again, just burning the undergrowth, and on the right is obviously a crown fire, which is a whole forest up in flames. A way to protect property, even in California, they actually sometimes do surface burns that are controlled, because if you control the undergrowth and the leaf litter, again, it reduces the chance for a devastating crown fire like you see on the right here. All right, so let's go back to talking about half of the world's forests have already been cut down. So deforestation, the temporary or permanent removal of large expanses of forest for agricultural settlements and other uses. Tropical forests are being cut down, especially in Latin America, Indonesia, and Africa, and the boreal forest, especially in Alaska, Canada, Scandinavia, and Russia, are being cut down again for timber, for lumber, for places to grow crops, for places to build homes. So another good chart. Deforestation. How does that degrade the natural capital of our forests? Obviously, water pollution and soil degradation from erosion. Roots of plants, guys, hold soil. So when you get rid of the roots of plants by destroying trees, right, there's nothing left to hold that soil, and so that soil erodes. And that also leads to flooding acceleration. It also leads to the extinction of specialist species that happen to live only in that type of forest. You also have habitat loss for native and migrating species. And you release carbon dioxide by burning the forest, and you lose the absorption of carbon dioxide. You don't have the trees anymore. So it's kind of a lose-lose situation there. This is just an example. This is severe soil erosion. This was a tropical forest that had been clear cut. Again, you see a couple of trees left, but it had been clear cut. It was also followed by livestock grazing. We'll talk about that more coming up, not so much in this chapter, but in some subsequent chapters. We'll talk about livestock, mass food production, and things like that. Again, This is erosion, right? You can see all the soil being eroded away, leaving this kind of, don't see that black humus, right? Which is that thick soil that is the fertile soil. Looks kind of reddish, kind of, that's not sandish, right? That's not really good nutrient soil there. And that's what can happen when you clear cut forests. So leads us to a core case study. How do we manage public lands in the United States? Well, between 1620 and 1920, forests in the eastern U.S. were decimated. They were only grown back naturally through secondary ecological succession, because between 1620 and 1920, we clear cut everything in this country. Large areas of old growth and second growth forests are cut down and replaced with biologically simplified tree plantations. I showed you some of those palm tree oil plants previously. It's happening here in the United States as well. Growing threat, hardwood forests cleared to produce wood pellet for export. Again, you're just clear cutting these forests. And this is really a disturbing but a powerful chart here. If you'll notice, these are actually old growth forests, right? Anywhere you see in green is an old growth forest over 200 years old. So in 1620, most of the east coast of the United States were covered in old growth forests. Look at 1920. Look at 1920. Wow. We cut all those forests down as a country that was going through our demographic transitions, right? We needed the lumber and we cut it all down. Look at what was left. Now, 2000, most of these are secondary growth forests, right? That have come out from secondary succession, so second growth forests in here now. But you can see we've managed it a little better, and a lot of our forests have grown back. But yes, when you walk around the woods here in Ardsley, when you go hiking in this area, those forests we see out there are not the original forests that were here in the 1600s. Those trees were all cut down. Everything you see outside now in this area are forests that are within 200-300 years old, believe it or not, because again, we cut them all down between 1620 and 1920 here in the United States. Obviously, we've talked about it. We'll talk about it a little more now. Tropical forests are disappearing rapidly. Majority of our tropical forests were lost since 1950, mostly in Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America, because they're growing through the demographic transition that we went through, right, 150, 200 years ago. But we're finding out clearing those trees obviously accelerates climate change and accelerates the other issues we've talked about: soil erosion, loss of biodiversity, etc. Indonesia leads the world in tropical deforestation because they're trying to produce that palm oil, right? They're destroying rainforests to produce palm oil. And again, here's the ethical dilemma with environmental science. How do we tell a country, a couple of hundred years maybe behind us in that demographic transition, that they can't do this when we did this? The reason why America is affluent is that we deforest our entire country. Now we're realizing that's wrong and we're letting the forest grow back. But how do you go tell Indonesia you can't make money for your people by producing palm oil because you're ruining biodiversity? You're ruining the environment. This is what we have to try to educate people and try to explain to them, and maybe try to help them out monetarily, right? Because again, how do you tell them they can't do it when we did it? Various causes of these tropical forests being removed: population growth, poverty of subsistence farmers, right, trying to get them to have more farmland, ranching, lumber, plantation farms like we just talked about, and global trade. So, how can we manage and sustain forests? Well, there are a couple of methods that we can use. First, we need to emphasize the value of their ecosystem services, right? That was the money, those money values I showed you a couple of slides ago. We need to halt government subsidies that hasten their destruction. We need to protect any old growth forests that we still have left on this planet. We need to harvest trees no faster than they are replenished. That's why the selective cutting is the best ecologically, right? Yes, one is being planted, you cut it down, you replenish it, you cut another down, instead of just stripping a forest of all its trees. And you need to plant trees to reestablish forests. So if you do clear cut, or you do selective cutting, or you do strip cutting, make sure you replace as many trees as you cut down with new seedlings to help reestablish those forests. So, widely used approaches to managing forests more sustainably: maximize your sustainable yield. So harvest the maximum amount of trees that will not reduce future yield, right? You need that balance. You don't want to cut down so many trees that then, 20 years from now, there's nothing left for you to cut down, right? You need to be selective in how you cut down your trees so that you can sustain your maximum yield. Ecosystem-based manager, right? Minimize the harmful harvesting impacts on the ecosystem. That's why, again, the selective cutting, a little bit better. And adaptive management. Harvest forest, evaluate results, and then modify your approach. If you do the harvest the forest, the strip cutting, and no trees are coming back, again, you may not want to do that again, okay? So, again, adapt in your management as you go along. So, what are the solutions? More sustainable forestry, include your ecosystem services and estimate in their economic values, identify and protect highly diverse forest areas, stop logging in our old growth forest, stop clear cutting on steep slopes, reduce road building in forest, and rely more on selective and strip cutting. Again, I would argue selective better, but if you can't, strip cutting much better than clear cutting. Leave most standing dead trees and larger fallen trees for wildlife habitat and nutrient cycling. Put tree plantations only on deforested and degraded land. Don't degrade or deforest more land. Find land that's already deforested or degraded, and that's where you put your tree plantations. And certify timber that is grown by sustainable methods so that if it's not, don't buy it, right? If we can certify, say, okay, this timber was made sustainably with methods that are sustainably, buy that timber. Don't buy timber that maybe is not grown by sustainable methods. So another way, improving our management of forest fires so that maybe we don't get those crown fires, right? So the U.S. Smokey the Bear educational campaign, when I was around, this was a huge campaign, not so much these days, but basically talks about the pros and cons of fire. Again, education. Use those prescribed burns, right? Removes flammable material and underbrush. I talked about that when we spoke about the surface fires. Like, use them, okay? Use those surface fires. Again, control them, but they can help protect you from the huge crown fires, and allow fires on public land to burn as long as structures aren't threatened, because again, that can help with reestablishing the biodiversity on those public lands. Protect structures in fire-prone areas, thin nearby trees and vegetation, eliminate the use of highly flammable construction material. Again, all ways to improve the management of forest fires. And then use drones with infrared sensors to detect fires and monitor the progress in fighting them. We need to reduce the demand for harvested trees as well, improve the efficiency of wood use. Again, these are all ways, guys, that we can help manage our forests more sustainably. I'm just kind of going through them one by one. All right, reduce the demand, improve the efficiency of wood. 60% of U.S. wood is wasted. Think about that. 60% is wasted, meaning is we're only using 40%. If we can even waste 30%, right? Half of this. Think about how much more wood we would have, how many less trees we would have to cut down. Make tree-free paper. Quinoa, rice straw, hemp can all be used to make paper, and reduce the use of throwaway paper products, right? I do have paper plates here in my room. Probably shouldn't. I probably should use ceramic plates when we meet for meetings. We sometimes have food. I use paper. I throw it out. Really not good. You should use regular plates. I have a dishwasher in here, so no excuse, Mr. Van Eck. I should get rid of those paper products going forward. This is a plant called Quinoa. Again, it's a fast-growing plant. It actually can be used to make paper. So instead of cutting down old-growth forests, maybe this could be a solution. Plant these. They grow very fast, and then you can use paper out of that. Ways to reduce tropical deforestation, right? Debt for nature swaps and conservation concessions. Protect forests in return for aid. That's kind of what I just said. Maybe we need to give Indonesia some money not to cut down their forests and to help their citizens become more affluent. Crack down on illegal logging. End government subsidies for logging roads. That, again, is the first stage of fragmenting your forest. Purchase only sustainably produced wood, like we just talked about. Put a seal on it that says that. And again, plant your forest on land that has already been degraded. All right, this is going to be the last slide for part one here, but again, a great One of our great charts, solutions for sustaining tropical forests. Again, I would know a little bit about this just so that you can use it on an FRQ. Prevention, protect the most diverse and endangered areas, educate settlers about sustainable agriculture and forestry, subsidize only sustainable forest use, protect forests through depth for nature swaps, certify that sustainably grown timber, and reduce poverty and slow population growth. How do we restore these forests? Encourage regrowth through secondary succession, rehabilitate degraded areas, and concentrate farming and ranching in areas that, again, have already been cleared. All right, that concludes part one of my lecture on sustaining terrestrial biodiversity. That was the forest, public lands. We'll move into grasslands, wetlands, and cities as we move on. Again, this will be a three-part lecture here on chapter 10. And again, part one is concluding now. And as always, I thank you for listening.